Spring 918. Done not a must I get up so early. It wasn't a question, and Osrith stood, arms folded, beside her son's bed. The son had been up an hour and so had she. Prizing young Finan from the comfort of his bed was challenging. If I can, you can, she told him, and instead of chiding him as a spoiled child as she was about to, Osrith said, don't you want to show Constantine how much you have learned? Athair says I can become a scholar, replied young Finan, stretching his arms and yawning. Athair, Osrith thought. She hadn't heard him call Constantine that before. Yet, Edra called him that, and so the boy must just have copied his sister. She waited as young Finan got on his boots and, still yawning, made his way down to the armory, his mother close behind him. True, the sun was just up, but she had been taking young Finan with her on patrol. Sainid had organized the watches, and Osrith had volunteered for the dawn watches, which she loved to start the day with. Young Finan, however, was not the best in the morning, but he was young, and would get used to it. And, it gave him ample time to see the land where he lived, the place that was his home, from the vantage point of a warrior. Helping him on with light mail, Osrith then led a yawning boy out to the stables, to one of the ponies. She had not regretted not challenging Constantine about going with him to the wall. Here was a good place for her, a peaceful place. The company had been gone for 3 weeks now, and no word had been sent, which was a good thing. Constantine was not calling for reinforcements, nor Eswi sending his spies with fast news of death or defeat. No, Osrith could only think that the meeting with Sigtryg, Ethelfled and Edward was a success, although there was no news as to when they might be returning. Come on, called Osrith, as they trotted towards the western gate. We are patrolling the forest valley today. She nodded to Tearleach, one of the guards, who nodded to Osrith as he opened the gate. Have you been there? Osrith asked. She liked spending time with young Finan. Time away had meant she had missed so much of his growing up, and though he would be 8 that year, he had done so much when she hadn't been around to see it. We swam there, Selark and Edra and I, young Finan told his mother as they got to a small loch filled by the Forth River as it came from the central highlands and occupied a wide inland bay. Edra did not want to go in, but she helped me to swim. Selark was a strong swimmer, he added. He showed me how. And can you swim now? Osrith asked her son, a sudden nervousness in her stomach when she thought of Ildub, drowning in a lake much the same as that one. It was no wonder Edra, who doted on Ildub as she grew up, was nervous about the water. I can, he told her, and Osrith said, as they travelled down the shallow slope to the water's edge. Show me. Young Finan did not need to be asked twice. Tying up his pony next to Osrith's, he stripped down to his underbreeches and shirt. Osrith did likewise, putting Bué within easy reach, for she did not plan to go very far. He was a good swimmer, Osrith thought, as they got out, having spent only a few minutes in the water. It was still cold, and the morning was not late enough to catch the day's heat from the sun. You swim excellently, Osrith told him, as they used the horses' under saddle blankets to get warm, and she watched as young Finan beamed at his mother. They were soon dressed and underway, taking the path to the right, through more densely packed trees that seemed to remove some of the day's growing light. What? Osrith thought, as she heard 2 thuds behind her. Young Finan turned too and his mother twisted her neck to see who was there, before encouraging her horse on. You ride better than I did at your age, Osrith complimented him. I didn't ride a horse until I was 12, or 13, and I had to be shown. And even then, I fell off so many times. Young Finan began to laugh, at the thought of his mother falling off her horse many times, but after a few minutes she quickened her horse again, holding up a hand to discourage his laughter. What? This time it was young Finan who said the word, and he looked about him as Osrith rode out of the trees quickly and into a clearing. She moved her horse back the other way and then saw the outlines of 2 shapes, 2 people-like shapes. Good, Osrith thought, her instincts had not flown from her. And within seconds, she was down by her horse, Bué up and in front of her, steadying her horse with her other gloved hand. Come at me, you bastards, Osrith thought, and, As she thought it, one man came stumbling out of the trees, ragged, and with a poorly cared for sword out in front of him. He lunged at Osrith, saying nothing of his intentions. They were clear enough. Behind her, the pony let out a startled whinny, and young Finan leaned back on her, unsure of what else to do. He watched as his mother parried the sword from his hand, and lunged at him with buée, cutting him on the arm, which made the man stumble back with a hoarse yell. "Stop, and I will be lenient," Osrith said in Gaelish. Then, she saw the Thor's hammer, and repeated it in Danish. But the man only looked at her with malevolent eyes and tried to raise his sword again. Osrith was too quick for him, and with the lunge that was aimed to her torso, dodged to the left and plunged her blade into the man's stomach. He fell back, reeling from the shock of the blow, staring at Osrith with his wide eyes. "Ragnall is coming," the man said in Norse, but it was too late for him. Not for Osrith, however, for she had seen the other figure stalking towards her. She skipped backwards, lest a hand from the dying man might try to grip her ankles. "Ragnall," Osrith declared, mockingly, though in truth she did feel unnerved. She would much have preferred Domhnall to be by her side, rather than young Finan. But he had to learn sometime, she supposed. It was no tea party to be a warrior, especially a guard. They had one of the hardest jobs of all with little thanks. She watched as the man tried to stalk her on the spot, weaving this way and that. She brightened, knowing now he must be the second of the two and there were no more. If there were more warriors he would have just staked her out, and waited for reinforcements. As it was, this man felt he had no choice but to go for her, even though he seemed as weak and pitiful specimen as the first poor unfortunate Norseman who lay dead at her feet. She got the impression both were either lost, or outcast in some way. Both seemed ravenous and had that thin, starved look of a person who had not seen food for a while. "Perhaps you don't need to fight me," Osrith told him. "You saw what happened to your friend here." "No friend of mine," the Norseman told her, glancing disdainfully at the man dead on the floor. "Why don't you come back to the fortress with me? I can give you food." At once, the man looked interested, as if the idea of food was restoring his health. But then he gave Osrith a very scared, very empty look. "I am no traitor," he told Osrith, "even if we are outcasts." So, Osrith thought, that was it. Was it? "Outcasts of Ragnall's men?" Osrith asked. "Did you fight at Seaster, at Eadspirig, at Eofuik?" At the names, the man seemed to brighten. "Then you must have been brave," Osrith added. "So, tell me, where is Ragnall?" And at the name, the man stiffened, as if the Norse leader was standing right by him. "He has invaded Strathclyde," the man told her, eyes sparking with a wickedness in the telling. "And he is on the march to Pitland." "Here," he emphasized, grinning a leering grin to Osrith. She felt her heart quicken as she thought of the fortress, with a very low level of guards surrounding it. They could defend it, yes, they had food, and could make the castle withstand a siege. But the thought of doing this without the Mormers, without Eswi, without Domhnall or Constantine, even, was alarming. She would have liked to turn away, race with the news back to Sened, discuss with him and the other two guard captains a strategy. But, the man still faced her. "I don't believe you," she bluffed, gripping buée for show. "I believe you are spies come to spread lies. There are no Norse heading west. You just want to make troob." But Osrith did not finish, for the Norseman was bearing down in the space between Osrith and young Finan. To his credit, the boy did not scream, nor did he scream when Osrith, much quicker with her blade than he was with his, plunged buée up under his ribs. She twisted for good measure, and the man heaved blood all down his neck and face, spitting it into the air before himself. As Osrith withdrew buée and wiped it on the meadowsweet that was just coming into flower under a thorn tree, before scooping up the two men's weapons, best to be put to use by Alba soldiers than bandits or other Norse outlaws that still might be lurking. Best up the patrols in the west, too, especially the forest. Osrith turned, and pulled herself back up onto the horse, urging young Finan to flank her, for they were going to go a shorter way through the woods and end up at the northern gates of Dunnottar. It took a few seconds for her to realize that young Finan was not with her. Osrith turned and looked at her son, who was pale in the face, with wide, staring eyes not much different to the starving Norseman dead behind them. His lip was quivering. "Bet you didn't think your mater could do that," she told him. Young Finan made a shake of his head, glanced at the dead men, and back to Osrith. He had a lot to learn, Osrith thought to herself, if this was a shock to him. But then, she thought, how old does a boy have to be to learn warcraft? She remembered the sons of the Mormers. Were they the same age? "Come on," Osrith said, kindly. "Let's get back to Senid, you'll feel better after a cup of hot milk." Young Finan nodded, and rode next to his mother. He listened when she went off into one of her stories, although this time it was one he had not heard before. Did I tell you the time I fought against the Norse and rescued King Constantine? He wasn't the king then, of course. His father was king. 88,888,888. I have heard about what she has done, but I didn't expect to see it happen, young Finan told Senid, while Osrith took sword practice outside. He could hear the clash of steel as his mother trained the Mormers' sons. He would have been out there, as Senid had advised, only he had thrown up in the stables and Senid had brought him inside the armory, wrapping him up in a blanket and finding him some well water to drink. "That's the life of a warrior," Senid told young Finan. "You get used to it, rather than you and your mater." At this, young Finan threw up all the water he had sipped over the last half an hour over the clean armory floor tiles. Senid gave him a rub on the shoulder. "I'll get Edra, shall I?" Senid offered, but young Finan held up a hand, before throwing up again. No. He spluttered. "I don't want anyone to see me like this." Senid rubbed his shoulder again, and then crouched to his level. "Perhaps you are sickening for something," he told young Finan, evenly. "Perhaps you need some time to recover from that." It wasn't a reasoned suggestion, merely a way to get out of an embarrassing situation, and even at young Finan's age he understood that, and smiled back to Senid gratefully. "I will try," he told Senid, once he had returned and they waited for Edra to come from the kitchens where she had been consulting on the linen. "I know mater only wants best for me, it's an honor to be a warrior, so Ater says, the king, I mean." "It is," Senid assured him. "And if you wish to be a scholar, so be it, but sometimes monasteries get attacked too, and it's best to know what to do with the pointy end." And young Finan smiled wanly to Senid as Edru put an arm around the boy and led him back to his bed. And Senid thought he had better let Osrith know what it was that her son had named Constantine. The boy thought the king was his father. 8,888,888 Corbridge, May 918. It had taken 3 weeks to get from Dunnottar to the old Roman wall, the demarcation line plotted by the soldiers from that empire. Here, they decided their land ended and that savagery began. Utad had been camping there, and moving around Yvering. He had known that someone was tailing him as he prepared his plan for Bibbenberg. They had less than 24 men. Constantine had 800, from Dunnottar, and also Diffenwell's men garrisoned at Caerleguilid. Utad had left, then, after thanking Constantine for ridding them of Inner White, who he had been paying as defenders of Bibbenberg, and who had been plotting to overthrow Wiha himself. The treaty between Constantine and Wiha still held, and Constantine's claim to the wall had gone unchallenged, because Edward had invaded Eothwic, despite a mercant treaty, which didn't apply to the West Saxons, it seemed. So Constantine had stationed Strathclydian and Pictish troops on the wall, probably the first time since the Romans had left, declaring to all who challenged them that the land to the wall, including Bibbenberg, was Elba. Now, Domhnall looked across to a weary, yet defiant Utad, who had been invited into the fort. Before, he had occupied it, and had given them poor welcome. One of his men had even killed Eadna, one of Engus's men, when he had been sent to make their welcome known. Ignorant Saxons, to not even bother to try to understand what the man was trying to tell them. This time, Constantine had arrived at Heavenfield, directly south, and had been met by one of Lady Ethelflaed's men. Aldhelm, he was called. Osrith had spoken of Aldhelm, of being a loyal but fair man. The lady, and the king of the West Saxons to camp at a village called Corbridge. That was in the Northumbrian section, south of the wall. He knew he looked magnificent, Domhnall thought, with his raven-black hair dressed with his gold circlet, gold found, no less, in Dulriada. Gaelish gold for a Gaelish king. Although, he was Alba now, the old countries far more united than ever the Anglish and Saxon kingdoms south seemed to be. His mail was polished until it shone, and Constantine wore his dark blue cloak, Domhnall's, once his father's and their grandfathers. Where it had come from, no one knew, but it was of the softest fabric and rarely collected dust and dirt. By far the most valuable thing Constantine had chosen to wear for the meeting was the gold chain at his neck from which a bright gold cross hung. This had been made at Doia by the monks at the monastery there at about the time of St. Comsil. It was said to have been given to King Bredy of the Picts as a token of acknowledgement of their faith. In fact, it had done Bredy so well, he had managed to kill the last of the kin of King Oswald, his nephew Ecgfrith, at Nictonsmere, and blessed the water at the mere with the gold of his chain. And now he was standing with 4 of his warriors, ready to ransom Selark as insurance that he would keep the agreement that would be made. Selark was nervous, of course, but he had been ransomed to Uhtred, currently warrior to Ethelflaed, before. Whether he would ever be of Bibbenberg was another matter. Constantine had his own agreement with Wigger, of course, and Uhtred would know this. Beside Constantine were his Mormers, Uunst and Felim, Engus a little to the left, Eswi, his spymaster to Domhnall's right. Beside him, Selark, and his nephew, Domhnall's son, Malcolm, and no one for Edward, King of Wessex. Domhnall noticed. Come, Constantine suggested, gesturing to one of the mile forts on the wall, a neutral place in that it bisected both the land that would be Alba and Northumbria. And they assembled inside the fortress, lit with torches that Constantine had had his men light earlier. So, you believe the land to the north of here is yours? Uhtred asked, bluntly. 2 mornings ago, Constantine replied, ignoring the demand in Uhtred's statement to reassert this fact. My men cleared Norsemen, Danes, from Bibbenberg's perimeter. I believe he was sent by you. I know of no Norsemen or Danes sent by me, Uhtred told him. Aldhelm took a few steps towards Eswi. Though they were representing opposite sides, they exchanged a look that said, typical. It was Constantine owning the fort, however, and he paced slowly, cat-like, amongst the nobles and told Uhtred, your cousin wouldn't let them in. He knew they would never leave. Were they Ragnall's men, hoping to secure Northumbria from the northeast? Uhtred said nothing for a second, then, with a mock bow said, thank you, Lord King, for clearing the way for me. For doing your work, Constantine replied, smiling broadly. More men have replaced the Northmen men, my men. He looked pleased with himself, Domhnall thought, as so he should. His cousin, king of the 3 kingdoms, now called Alba, crowned and recognized by 3 peoples, was well on the way to securing the land to the wall and subsuming what was once Bernicia. So, it is peace you seek? Uhtred asked, and Domhnall thought that the man looked fairly agitated. What was it, he thought. Did guilt sit on his shoulders after all? It is, nodded Constantine. With 700 or 800 men, Uhtred commentated, striding past Constantine, and looking at the wall torches freshly lit. Constantine did not command to the wall yet. He did not keep a garrison. More, Constantine told him. More than a match for the 200 or so at Dunham, led by your latest wife, I believe. At this, Uhtred broke into a play-acted smile, and folded his arms. I have men at Dunham, he told Constantine. More than a match for the handful of mercenaries on the border. And here Constantine nodded to Aldhelm, and West Saxons, all of you are a long way from home. Whereas you, good king, have sent my sister to defend Bibbenberg. It was here that was the start of the enmity between them that day, Domhnall thought, as he watched his cousin debate with Uhtred the Daneslayer. It was then when his own anger, which he thought he had under control, rippled to the surface of his mind. This man had harmed his sister, on purpose, for a grudge, for a truth which was not, and Constantine knew it. "I am here to discuss peace," Constantine told him, then looked to Aldhelm. "You speak for the Lady of the Mercens, Lord Aldhelm?" "I do," Aldhelm agreed. "And Hereward for King Edward, for the West Saxons." He nodded to a large, rangy man dressed in the polished armor bearing Edward's crest. "And I am obliged to point out that Sigtrygg's peace is with Mercia, not Wessex." "Yet, West Saxons now occupy Eothwick," noted Constantine. "Tell me, Lord Aldhelm, how does King Sigtrygg of Northumbria respond to a foreign king invading his borders?" At this, Uhtred rounded on Constantine, forwarding the question off the table. It was well known that he was displeased, Domhnall thought, but it was Uhtred who changed the subject. He glanced at Domhnall's banner, the red right hand of Ulster. "You say the wall is your natural border," he told Constantine. To give him his credit, his cousin's face was impassive, uninterpretable, and he gave no hint of weakness. But it was true that there was a wall, a boundary stretching from the Clyde to the Forth. "A ditch, which failed," Constantine replied. "I say, this should be the frontier," Uhtred challenged him. "Then the Anglo and Saxon races would no more be subjected to raids by the Picts, by the Rus, and Cumbraland can take back Uist and Bernicia can take back to the Forth." No ripple, no concern on Constantine's face, Domhnall thought. He had learned well from Domhnall in the end, and from his own mother, Malmuir. "Northumbria should look to its southern borders, Lord Uhtred," Constantine told him. "The king of the West Saxons does not rule in Northumbria." Domhnall felt his hand go to his hip. He sensed a figure lingering by the door. He blinked, but the figure was still there. Listening, it seemed. "He will," Uhtred told him, and Domhnall could sense Constantine's manner was irking Osrith's brother somewhat. So he wasn't surprised when Constantine continued like that. "Bibbenberg is north of the wall," Constantine pointed out. And there was a scrape of steel, though Uhtred had not withdrawn his blade. He was tense, Domhnall considered, more tense than the usual bad words ought to elicit. "Bibbenberg is mine," Uhtred declared, losing his temper at last. "No," Constantine replied, coolly, and he continued to walk slowly in a wide arc in front of Osrith's elder brother. "It was never yours. It belonged to your father and now your cousin, maybe even belongs to your sister. But your cousin needs a wife," Constantine pointed out. "I have a daughter." Uhtred glared at him. "She is not yours to give, and besides, is she not already betrothed?" But Domhnall watched as his cousin raised a hand and waved it gently. "Come now, Uhtred, let us talk of peace," Constantine replied, talking as if to a scared child. "Your peace is conquest," Uhtred replied. But the king of Alba stood still and continued in the slow, encouraging tone. "We are moving the frontier back to where it should be. Bibbenberg is mine." And it seemed then that the air shifted. The Uhtred with his petulant tone evaporated and an Uhtred with a low, deep violence appeared. "Not while I live," he told Constantine. "I know you have been having me watched again." "Why would I want to kill you?" asked Constantine, lightly. But eyes quicker than Domhnall's had seen the movement and blades were withdrawn by Angus's guards. He had stepped beside Uhtred. A crackling from a wall torch was the only sound for a moment as the man spoke. "Because you fear him." Constantine stood still, silent, just his mouth turned into a soft smile. "I know of you, fine you I can chopper, of the Alate," Constantine replied. "Husband to poor Gormelith, brother to dead Connell, torturer of a poor unfortunate child and robber of her blade. Gin to me as the I kneel." He gestured to Domhnall, as the Pitlanders, and then to Angus and Phelim and, nodding to Eswi, Strathclyde, Dulriata. If Finan was expecting a rebuke of some sort for his past, Domhnall considered, he wasn't expecting that. There was a faint grimace, too, on Constantine's face, which hardened, as did his voice. "This fort is now my property, are all the lands north of it. You have until sundown to leave. You will go south from here." He turned to Aldhelm. "The king of Wessex has betrayed Mercia, betrayed the alliance your country had for Eofoic. Tell your lady that while she believes Hywel of the Cymric has an alliance with her, I have evidence Hywel is supporting Ragnar to destabilize Northumbria. That was news to everyone, Domhnall thought, including himself. Did we know this? Osrith had told him on several occasions he never wanted to hold rule in Northumbria. Could he be persuaded through Waldhere, the Whigger's man who came to Constantine with news, to leave Bibbenberg in her care? With Alba support, his fortress would be protected, and he could go off to sea with his men, while Osrith acted as caretaker, as steward. But then Constantine did something else that was as surprising as anything else. Summoning Eswi, he called over his son. Prince Selark, who had said nothing throughout all of this, stood, equally impassively, beside his father. He was to be a hostage again in recognition of a treaty which meant all factions, no matter who, would treat Ragnar as the enemy, and join to dispark him and his army. Did it hurt, being called what you are? Domhnall in Gaelish, who had been in the mood for a fight, was disappointed when he was asked, with the other noble guards, to escort the guests to the Northumbrian side of the wall. Uhtred was talking to Aldhelm, and his men were finding the horses. Finan, it seemed, was not expecting to be asked that, and turned, face fixed, to the exiled Uyneel prince. Domhnall stalked a few steps towards Uhtred's dearest friend and stood in front of him. No insults had been exchanged, but he himself had been stewing on a few. Just tell me, did you even love her? He continued, ignoring the men of Constantine's behind him, and the almost instant appearance of Sihtric and Osrith in the vicinity of Finan. I do love her, Finan told him. Osrith, she, Ethne, Domhnall emphasized. My sister. I understand that she spent the last years of her life with you. It was only then that he realized how deeply he did care about the matter. Finan stopped in the process of withdrawing his sword. I did love her, he told Domhnall. And what about Gormlaith? Domhnall's voice took on a hard tone. Finan said nothing, so your record with women grows worse. He folded his arms, ignoring the swords out and pointing in his direction. Osrith will be away from you, at least, now, which is one thing. And Domhnall turned, as if pretending to leave. He saw Finan's eyes widen, and turned back, half a smirk on his face. She is to be married. He left the sentence for a good few seconds, before adding, did you not know, bastard Alaid? Prince Domhnall called Eswi, warningly in Gaelish. You are needed. But Domhnall's attention was well and truly on Finan, and his on Domhnall. Which man? Finan asked, anger cutting through his mood like acid. Tell me now, you touched Nailch, or I will skewer you here and now. Domhnall continued to smirk. I spend a great deal with her, Domhnall went on. And, yourself? Finan interjected, with disbelief in his voice. Domhnall paused for just a second, long enough for the possibility to enter the bastard's head. Sainid, Constantine's cousin, he told Finan, eventually. Which man is Sainid? Finan asked, ranging the men behind Domhnall with his eyes. But Domhnall shook his head. I should have found you and killed you, after what you did to Gormlaith, he told Finan, now withdrawing his own sword. She was King Dyfnwal's sister. He glanced over his shoulder. More than half of Constantine's men are Strathclydians, he added. Which meant that, of the 1,000 or so swords the King of Alba had to call on, 500 or so had a grudge on behalf the king for his exiled sister. Reckon you should, Finan told him, dismissively, for slavery was worse than death. Domhnall backed away, sword still aloft. I will look for you on the battlefield. I will be waiting, Finan called back, his own sword raised to chest level. And I will carve your black heart from your chest, you lump of goose shit. Finan, come on, called Sihtric, who was now to his left and hanging on to his comrade's arm lest he begin a fight there and then. Not before I've broken your legs and arms, ye shrivel-cocked weasel. Domhnall spat back, the Alba men's murmurings behind him growing a little louder. He watched as he stalked away with Sihtric, and then turned. But then looked back when he heard Finan should. Ailch. Finan shouted in Gaelish, a grin on his face. She calls me Finan more. And the good reason for that. What was that about? Uhtred asked, as Finan trod towards his horse. He raised his eyes to his friend and gave him a terse look. "An old score," Finan told him. "Which is not settled," he added, shrugging his shoulders. "And nor will it be until he is dead in the mud." "I know it," Utad told him. A few moments later, as Utad's men, along with Aldhelm, headed southeast towards Edward's and Ethelflaed's camp. "We know one thing, he's desperate for Bibbenberg." "Not as desperate as you," Finan thought. And then touched his chest. He would read the letter later, the letter given to him by the man who he recognized as a spy he had seen in Aylesbury, years before. She would meet him, he had confided, when he slipped the letter into Finan's hand as they had left. At Street Cuthbert's Cove,